The 88-year-old woman's hand shook as she stared at the bill. But the nursing home director snatched it back and slammed it on the table. $12,000. If you can't pay, we're moving you to the state facility today, he said, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. She tried to ask for time, apologizing through tears. But he stood over her and tapped the paper with his pen. 2 staff members stood by the door with a wheelchair as she begged for one more day. When a court investigator walked in holding a different set of financial records, the director's face went from confident to panicked in seconds. Because those records didn't show a debt, they showed a payment made 3 months ago, a payment the nursing home had deliberately hidden. And what the investigator said next made the director realize his entire operation was about to collapse. Before we go any further, I need to know, where are you watching this from and what time is it right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. And listen, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now and smash that like button. Because what's about to be exposed in this nursing home is exactly why we need to pay attention when the vulnerable are trapped in systems designed to exploit them. Sometimes the people claiming you owe money are the ones who've been stealing from you all along. And what this court investigator uncovered is going to show you just how deep the corruption goes. Stay with me, because this case isn't just about one woman. It's about hundreds of families who've been robbed blind and told to be grateful for it. Her name was Dorothy Whitman, and she was 88 years old. Dorothy had been a nurse for 39 years. She'd worked in 3 different hospitals over her career, starting as a floor nurse in 1955 and retiring as a head nurse in the pediatric unit in 1994. She'd spent 4 decades caring for sick children, holding the hands of terrified parents, working double shifts during flu seasons and emergencies. She'd been the kind of nurse who remembered every child's name, who'd sneak extra pudding cups to kids who were scared, who'd stay late to rock crying babies when their parents couldn't be there. When she'd retired, the hospital had held a party with over 100 former patients and families attending. They'd presented her with a plaque that read, "To Dorothy, who made the worst days bearable and taught us what compassion looks like." Dorothy had been married to her husband Frank for 54 years. He'd been a high school history teacher, had coached basketball, had spent his summers working construction to supplement their income. They'd raised 2 children, a son named Michael and a daughter named Sarah. They'd lived modestly but happily in a small house with a garden where Frank grew tomatoes and Dorothy kept roses. They'd been the kind of couple who still held hands after 50 years, who finished each other's sentences, who'd never spent a night apart except when Dorothy had to work overnight shifts. Frank had died 7 years ago. Stroke, sudden and massive. He'd been watering the tomatoes one Sunday afternoon, had collapsed, and had been gone before the ambulance arrived. Dorothy had found him there in the garden, the hose still running, water pooling around his feet. She'd knelt beside him in the mud and had held him until the paramedics gently pulled her away. Dorothy had tried to keep living in their house after Frank died, but it had been too hard. Too many memories, too much space, too much maintenance for a woman in her 80s to handle alone. Her children had encouraged her to sell it and move somewhere with support. Dorothy had resisted for 2 years, but eventually the loneliness and the burden of upkeep had worn her down. She'd sold the house and had moved into Meadowbrook Senior Living, a nursing home, though they called it an assisted living community, on the outskirts of town. Meadowbrook was a mid-sized facility with 78 residents, most of them in their 80s and 90s. It was clean and reasonably well-maintained, with a dining hall, activity rooms, and small private apartments. The marketing materials had promised dignity, independence, and compassionate care. The monthly cost was $4,200 $200, which included room, board, basic medical care, and activities. Dorothy's pension from the hospital, combined with Social Security, gave her $4,900 a month. It was tight, but manageable. Dorothy had moved in 3 years ago. She'd settled into a routine: breakfast in the dining hall, morning walks in the courtyard when weather permitted, afternoon card games with other residents, dinner at 5:30. She'd made a few friends, mostly other widows, who understood what it was like to outlive the person you'd planned to grow old with. She missed Frank every day, missed her house, missed her independence. But Meadowbrook was safe, and she was too old and tired to live alone anymore. Her children visited when they could. Sarah, who lived 3 hours away, came once a month and called every week. Michael, who lived out of state, visited 3 or 4 times a year. They were good kids, Dorothy thought. They had their own lives, their own families. She didn't want to be a burden. The problems had started 6 months ago, though Dorothy hadn't realized it at the time. One morning in April, Dorothy had been called to the administrative office. The director, a man in his early 50s named Craig Sutherland, had asked her to sit down. He'd been friendly, professional, wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitman, we need to discuss your account." Dorothy had felt a flutter of anxiety. "Is something wrong?" "There's been an issue with your insurance coverage. It seems your supplemental insurance didn't cover some of the medical services we provided last month. You have an outstanding balance of $2,800. Dorothy had stared at him, confused. "What services?" Craig had slid a paper across the desk, an itemized bill with codes and abbreviations Dorothy didn't understand. "Physical therapy, medication management, additional nursing care. All standard services we provide, but your insurance classified them as non-covered." "But I didn't ask for extra services. I take my own medications. I don't need therapy." "Mrs. Whitman, these are services we provide to all residents as part of ensuring quality care. They're outlined in your residency agreement." Dorothy had tried to read the bill, but the print was small and her hands were shaking. "I don't understand. I thought everything was included in my monthly fee." "Basic services are included. These are additional services that Medicare and your supplemental insurance should have covered, but they denied the claims, so the balance falls to you." "I don't have $2,800. Craig's smile had faded slightly. "I understand that's difficult to hear, but the services have already been provided. The bill needs to be paid. We can set up a payment plan if needed." Dorothy had felt overwhelmed, out of her depth. She'd always paid her bills. She'd never owed anyone money. The thought of being in debt to the nursing home, the place where she lived, where she depended on them for everything, had terrified her. How much would the payments be? "We could do $500 a month for 6 months. $500 a month. That would leave Dorothy with almost nothing after rent and utilities. No money for clothes or personal items or the small luxuries that made life bearable. A cup of coffee in the cafe, a magazine, a birthday card to send to her grandchildren. But what choice did she have? She'd agreed. Craig had drawn up a payment plan agreement. Dorothy had signed it, her hands shaking, not fully understanding what she was agreeing to, but trusting that the nursing home wouldn't cheat her. They were caring for her. They wouldn't lie. She'd made the first payment in May, $500. It had hurt her budget, but she'd managed by eating less, skipping the cafe, giving up the small comforts she'd allowed herself. The second payment in June, the third in July. By August, Dorothy had lost 12 pounds. She looked gaunt, her clothes hanging loose, Staff had noticed but hadn't commented. Or if they had, nothing had changed. In September, Craig had called her back to his office. Dorothy had walked there slowly, her walker scraping against the linoleum, a sense of dread building in her chest. When she'd sat down, Craig had slid another paper across the desk. "Mrs. Whitman, we have another issue." Dorothy had felt her stomach drop. "What now?" "There's been a reassessment of your care needs. Our medical staff has determined you require a higher level of supervision. That means an increase in your monthly rate." "How much of an increase?" $800 a month. Your new rate will be $5,000 starting October 1st. $5,000. Dorothy only had $4,900 coming in each month. "I can't afford that." "I understand, but this is based on your care needs. It's not optional." "But I don't need more supervision. I'm fine. I take care of myself." "Mrs. Whitman, you're 88 years old. You use a walker. You've had several near falls that staff have documented. We have a responsibility to ensure your safety, and that requires additional resources." Dorothy had felt tears burning in her eyes. "So, what am I supposed to do?" Craig had leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "We can work with you, but the increased rate is effective immediately. And unfortunately, you still have a remaining balance of $1,400 on your previous payment plan. That needs to be paid in full before we can adjust your plan for the new rate." Dorothy's mind had been spinning. "I thought I'd paid $1,500 so far. The bill was $2,800. That means I owe $1,300, not $1,400. Craig had glanced at the paper. There were additional late fees and administrative costs. The current balance is $1,400. I've never been late on a payment. The fees are part of the agreement you signed." Dorothy had tried to read the original agreement Craig pulled from her file, but the text was dense and full of legal language she didn't understand. She'd felt trapped, helpless, like the walls were closing in. "I can't pay $1,400. I barely have anything left after your $500 a month." "Then we have a problem, Mrs. Whitman." Craig's voice had lost its professional veneer. Now it was just cold. "If you can't meet your financial obligations, we'll have no choice but to transfer you to a state facility." "A state facility?" Dorothy had heard horror stories about state-run nursing homes. Overcrowded, understaffed, patients neglected, abused. "Please, I just need time." "You've had time, 4 months, and the balance keeps growing." Craig had stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "I'll give you 2 weeks to come up with the $1,400. After that, we'll begin transfer proceedings." Dorothy had left his office in tears. She'd gone back to her small room and had sat on her bed, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what to do. She'd called Sarah, her daughter, but had gotten voicemail. She'd left a message, trying to keep her voice steady, asking Sarah to call her back. But Sarah was busy. 3 kids, a full-time job, a husband who traveled for work. She didn't call back for 2 days, and when she did, Dorothy had tried to explain but had started crying and couldn't get the words out. Sarah had promised to visit that weekend, but before Sarah could visit, everything had escalated. 2 weeks after Craig's ultimatum, Dorothy had been called back to the administrative office. This time, Craig hadn't been alone. 2 staff members, large, intimidating men who worked as orderlies, had been standing near the door. Craig had been sitting at his desk, and on the desk was a bill. Not $1,400, $12,000. Dorothy had stared at it, her brain unable to process the number. "What is this?" This is your total outstanding balance, Mrs. Whitman. The previous amounts plus additional charges for the increased care level, plus penalties for non-payment. 12,000? How is that possible? It's all itemized here. Craig had pushed the bill toward her, but before Dorothy could reach for it, he'd snatched it back and had slammed it on the table, making her jump. $12,000. If you can't pay, we're moving you to the state facility today. Dorothy's hands had started shaking violently. Today? But I haven't. I need to talk to my daughter. Your daughter isn't here. You are. And you owe this facility $12,000. We've been more than patient, Mrs. Whitman, but our patience is done. Please, just give me time to figure this out. Time's up. Craig had stood, his voice sharp, echoing in the small office. Dorothy had flinched. You have two options. Pay the $12,000 right now, or we transfer you today. Dorothy had started crying, her voice breaking. I don't have $12,000. I don't understand how the bill got so high. I've been paying. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Craig had tapped the bill with his pen, hard, the sound sharp and aggressive. We've tried to work with you. We've been flexible. But this is a business, not a charity. The two staff members had moved closer. One had a wheelchair. Dorothy had looked at them, then at Craig, panic rising in her chest. Are you really going to throw me out? We're transferring you to a facility better suited to your financial situation. Craig's tone had been patronizing, like he was explaining something to a child. The state facility has openings. They'll take you today. But all my things, you'll have time to pack a bag. The rest can be stored or picked up by your family later. Dorothy had felt like she was drowning. She'd begged. Actually begged. Please, just one more day. Let me call my daughter. Let me figure this out. Craig had looked at his watch. You have 1 hour. If your daughter can bring $12,000 in cash or certified check within 1 hour, you can stay. Otherwise, you're leaving. Dorothy had tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. One of the staff members had helped her into the wheelchair, though she hadn't asked for it. They'd wheeled her back to her room, had told her to start packing. Dorothy had called Sarah, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Sarah had answered immediately, alarm in her voice. Mom? Mom, what's wrong? Dorothy had tried to explain, but had kept dissolving into tears. Sarah had finally understood enough. $12,000. Mom, that's insane. I don't have that. Let me call Michael. Let me call the nursing home. Don't do anything. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 3 hours. But they didn't have 3 hours. Craig had given them 1, and the clock was ticking. Hold on, because what you're about to hear is the moment everything changed. Sarah made a phone call to a number she'd found online. One call to the state ombudsman's office, and that call set in motion something Craig Sutherland never saw coming. If you think nursing homes should be investigated for financial abuse, drop a comment saying, "Investigate them all," right now. And if you're still watching, hit that like button. Because what happens when the court investigator shows up is going to prove that sometimes the system works. But only when someone knows to ask for help. Sarah had called the state ombudsman's office for long-term care facilities. She'd been frantically searching online while driving, trying to find anyone who could help, and had found the number. She'd pulled over, called, and had gotten a woman named Patricia Vance, a senior investigator who'd been working in elder care oversight for 19 years. Sarah had explained the situation. Her mother being threatened with immediate transfer, the $12,000 bill that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, the 1-hour ultimatum. Patricia had asked a few pointed questions. Does your mother have the original residency agreement? Has she received itemized bills for all these charges? Has anyone explained exactly what services justify $12,000? Sarah hadn't known the answers. Patricia had said, I'm coming there right now. Don't let them move your mother until I arrive. Tell them a state investigator is on the way, and any transfer before I review the case will trigger an immediate investigation of the entire facility. Sarah had relayed that message to Craig when he'd called her back. Craig's tone had changed immediately. A state investigator? That's unnecessary. We can work this out. Then you can wait 2 hours until she gets there. Craig had agreed, though his voice had been tight with barely controlled anger. Patricia had arrived 90 minutes later. She was a black woman in her mid-50s, wearing a state ID badge and carrying a briefcase. She'd walked into Meadowbrook like she owned it, had gone directly to Craig's office, and had informed him she was conducting an immediate preliminary review of Dorothy Whitman's account. I'll need all financial records related to Mrs. Whitman, the original residency agreement, all amendments to that agreement, all itemized bills, and all payment records. I'll also need to interview Mrs. Whitman privately. Craig had tried to assert control. I'm not sure I can provide all of that without proper authorization. Patricia had handed him a document. This is my authorization. It's signed by the State Director of Long-Term Care Oversight. If you refuse to cooperate, I can have this facility's license suspended pending a full audit. Your choice. Craig had gone pale. He'd gathered the requested documents. Though Patricia had noticed he'd taken his time, had seemed to be looking through them carefully before handing them over. When he'd finally given her Dorothy's file, Patricia had sat down in a conference room and had started reviewing. What she'd found had made her jaw tighten. The original residency agreement Dorothy had signed 3 years ago clearly stated that the monthly fee of $4,200 covered all standard care, including medications, nursing support, activities, and meals. Additional charges were only permitted for services explicitly requested by the resident or their family, or for services deemed medically necessary by an outside physician. But the bills Craig had been giving Dorothy showed charges for additional services that were vague and undefined. Enhanced monitoring, specialized care coordination, premium medication management. None of these services had been requested by Dorothy. None had been authorized by an outside physician. They'd simply been added to her bill. More damning, Patricia had found a payment record showing that Dorothy had made a lump sum payment of $12,350 in June, 3 months ago. The payment had come from the sale of some stocks Dorothy had inherited from Frank. Sarah had helped her liquidate them to pay off what they'd thought was the outstanding balance after the initial $2,800 bill had grown to $12,350 with fees and penalties. That payment should have zeroed out Dorothy's account. But Craig's current bill showed she still owed $12,000. The June payment wasn't listed anywhere in the records Craig had provided. Patricia had gone back to Craig's office with the evidence. Mr. Sutherland, I need you to explain something. Mrs. Whitman made a payment of $12,350 in June. Where is that payment in your records? Craig's face had gone from confident to panicked in seconds. I'd need to check with our accounting department. I've reviewed your accounting records. The payment isn't there. But I found the bank deposit record in the facility's general ledger. The money was deposited. So, where did it go? Craig had stammered. There may have been a processing error. A processing error that disappeared $12,000. Patricia's voice had been cold. Or did you deliberately hide that payment so you could claim Mrs. Whitman still owed money and collect twice? I would never... Patricia had placed another document on the desk. This is a financial record I obtained from your bank with a court order I arranged on my drive here. It shows that in the past 18 months, this facility has received over $300,000 in payments from residents that were never properly credited to their accounts. Instead, the money was deposited into a discretionary fund that you control personally. Want to explain that? Craig had stood up abruptly. I need to call my lawyer. You do that. In the meantime, I'm placing this facility under immediate state oversight. No resident will be transferred, no bills will be collected, and no financial transactions will occur without state approval until a full audit is complete. And I'm referring this case to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Craig had walked out of his own office without another word. He'd gone to his car, and according to later reports, he'd driven straight to his lawyer's office. By the time Sarah arrived at Meadowbrook 3 hours after her frantic call, Patricia had already been interviewing other residents and staff members. What Patricia uncovered over the next 3 days was even worse than the initial evidence suggested. Craig Sutherland had been running a systematic scheme for nearly 2 years. He'd target residents who were elderly, cognitively vulnerable, or isolated. People without family members who visited regularly or who were capable of reviewing complex financial documents. He'd add charges to their accounts for services that were either never provided or were already covered by the monthly fee. He'd hide payments residents made, then claim they were still in debt and threaten them with transfer to state facilities. The fear of being sent away was enough to make most residents and their families pay whatever Craig demanded. Over 23 residents had been affected. The total amount stolen, $473,000. Some residents had paid multiple times for the same debt. Others had been forced to liquidate their savings or sell property to cover fabricated bills. One 92-year-old man had given Craig his entire life savings, $87,000, to avoid being transferred. The money had disappeared into Craig's personal accounts. Craig had covered his tracks by maintaining 2 sets of financial records, one showing the legitimate transactions, another showing the fraudulent charges and hidden payments. He'd been caught only because Patricia had known exactly what to look for and had acted fast enough that Craig hadn't been able to destroy evidence. The district attorney had filed charges within a week, 23 counts of elder financial abuse, fraud, theft, and embezzlement. Craig had been arrested at his home, had tried to flee when police arrived, and had been caught 3 blocks away. His bail had been set at $500,000. He hadn't been able to make it. The case had gone to trial 8 months later. The courtroom had been packed with victims and their families, advocates from elder rights organizations, and journalists covering what had become one of the largest nursing home fraud cases in state history. Dorothy had testified. She'd walked slowly to the stand, her walker beside her, and had described the fear, the confusion, the shame of thinking she couldn't manage her own finances. "He made me feel stupid," she'd said, her voice breaking. "Like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't understand simple numbers. But I wasn't losing my mind. He was stealing from me." 22 other residents or their family members had testified. Each story was similar: mysterious charges, hidden payments, threats of transfer, and the crushing fear of losing their home and being sent somewhere worse. The defense had tried to argue that the charges were legitimate, that the payments had been processing errors, that Craig had been trying to keep the facility financially viable. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Bank records, 2 sets of books, testimonies from staff members who'd been ordered to deliver threatening messages to residents, electronic communications showing Craig discussing which residents were most vulnerable and easiest to exploit. The jury had deliberated for 7 hours. Their verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, a woman in her late 60s named Elizabeth Monroe, had sentenced Craig to 12 years in prison, the maximum allowed, plus full restitution to all victims and fines totaling over $200,000. Judge Monroe's words at sentencing had been searing. "Mr. Sutherland, you preyed on the most vulnerable people in our society, people who trusted you with their care, their safety, their final years. You stole not just their money, but their dignity and peace of mind. You made them feel worthless, confused, and helpless. And you did it deliberately, systematically for years. This sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and the harm you caused. I hope you spend every day of your incarceration thinking about the lives you destroyed." Craig had shown no emotion. He'd been led away in handcuffs, and he'd never expressed remorse. The facility itself had been sold to a nonprofit organization specializing in ethical senior care. All residents had been allowed to stay, their accounts had been corrected, and every fraudulent charge had been reversed. Dorothy's account had been credited the $1,350 she'd paid in June, plus the $1,500 she'd paid on the fake payment plan, plus $3,000 in compensation for the stress and harm caused. Her monthly rate had been reduced to the original $4,200 with a guarantee it wouldn't increase without her written consent and verification by an outside financial advocate. But Dorothy hadn't stayed at Meadowbrook. After everything that had happened, she couldn't. The place held too much fear, too many bad memories. Sarah had moved her to a different facility closer to her own home, a place with transparent billing, strong state oversight, and a reputation for treating residents with dignity. Dorothy had lived another 4 years. She died peacefully at 92, with Sarah holding her hand in a place where she felt safe. At her funeral, Patricia Vance, the investigator who'd saved her, had spoken about the day she'd gotten Sarah's call, about how close Dorothy had come to being transferred before anyone knew what was really happening. Dorothy's case changed everything, Patricia had said. It led to new state laws requiring nursing homes to provide transparent, itemized billing. It led to mandatory financial audits of all facilities. It led to protections that make it illegal to threaten residents with transfer as a collection tactic. And it led to the prosecution of one of the most prolific elder abusers I've ever encountered. She'd paused, looking at the assembled mourners. But it almost didn't happen. If Sarah hadn't known to call the ombudsman, if I hadn't been able to get there in time, if Dorothy had been just a little more isolated, Craig would still be stealing. And Dorothy would have spent her final years in a state facility, believing she'd failed, believing she couldn't manage her own life. One phone call changed everything. Remember that. Craig Sutherland served 8 years of his 12-year sentence before being released on parole. He was required to pay restitution to all victims, an amount that would take him the rest of his life to repay. He was banned from ever working in healthcare or elder care in any capacity. He moved to another state and worked in warehouse logistics, his past following him everywhere. The nursing home industry had changed significantly because of Dorothy's case. The state had implemented random financial audits of all facilities. Residents were now required to receive quarterly statements showing all charges and payments in plain language. A hotline was established for residents and families to report suspected financial abuse, with protections for whistleblowers. And across the country, Dorothy Whitman's story had been used in training for elder care advocates, for adult protective services workers, for anyone working with vulnerable seniors. This is what financial abuse looks like. This is how predators operate. And this is why vigilance matters. Because Dorothy's case had proven something crucial, that the people we trust with our elderly loved ones are sometimes the ones harming them. That nursing homes can be run by criminals hiding behind smiles and professional titles. That a bill isn't always legitimate just because it's printed on official letterhead. And that sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, when the walls are closing in, when you're about to lose everything, one phone call can change the course of history. Sarah's call to Patricia had saved her mother, but it had also saved 22 other residents. And it had changed the system enough that future Dorothys might be protected before they're robbed blind. Because that's what justice looks like. Not perfect, not always fast, but sometimes, just sometimes, actually working. So here's my final question for you. If your elderly parent or grandparent told you their nursing home was charging them for things they didn't understand, would you investigate immediately? Would you call someone? Would you demand to see itemized records? Or would you assume the facility knows what it's doing and trust them? Be honest in the comments. Because our instinct to trust institutions, to assume elderly people are confused rather than being exploited, is exactly what predators like Craig count on. And if Dorothy's story reminded you that we need to be vigilant, that we need to ask questions, that we need to protect the people who can't protect themselves anymore, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. And share this video with every single person you know who has a family member in a nursing home. Because somewhere right now, another Craig is stealing. Another Dorothy is being threatened. Another family is about to pay a bill they don't actually owe. And the only thing that stops it is people like Sarah making the call. People like Patricia showing up with authority and demanding answers. People like you paying attention and refusing to accept "because I said so" as an answer when someone's livelihood is at stake. Be Sarah. Make the call, ask the questions, demand the records. Because that's how we protect the people who built the world we inherited. That's how we honor them. And that's how we make sure their final years are spent in dignity, not fear. What are you going to choose?